She should have been remembered as England's first queen regnant. Instead, her name was systematically erased from history books for centuries. This is the story of Empress Matilda, a woman who fought kings, survived impossible odds, and came within a crown's width of ruling England, only to have her legacy stolen by the very men who swore to serve her. Tonight, we are diving into one of history's most brutal character assassinations, a medieval, psychological warfare campaign so effective that for over 800 years, most people have never heard her name. This is the story of betrayal, survival, and the price of being a woman who dared to claim power in a world designed to destroy her. Our story begins in 1102, in the glittering court of Henry I of England. But this is not a fairy tale, it is a carefully orchestrated political tragedy that would span decades. Matilda was born into a world where women were currency, not rulers. At just 8 years old, she was already a pawn in her father's grand chess game. Henry I had a problem. He needed allies, and the most valuable alliance currency he possessed was his daughter. In 1110, when Matilda was barely 8, Henry made a decision that would shape the rest of her life. He betrothed her to Henry V, the Holy Roman Emperor, a man 30 years her senior, ruler of the most powerful empire in Europe. Think about that for a moment. An 8-year-old girl, sent across treacherous seas to a foreign land, to marry a man old enough to be her grandfather, all in the name of political convenience. But here's where Matilda's story takes its first unexpected turn. Instead of becoming a silent, decorative wife, she thrived. The Holy Roman Empire gave her something England never would have: respect for female authority. In Germanic tradition, empresses weren't just ornamental. They governed, they commanded, they ruled in their husband's absence. For 15 years, Matilda learned statecraft, military strategy, and the art of absolute power. She signed imperial documents. She held court. She governed provinces. Contemporary chronicles describe her as intelligent, decisive, and most dangerously for what was to come, confident in her own authority. But in 1125, Emperor Henry V died. Matilda was just 23, widowed, and suddenly, the most eligible and dangerous woman in Europe. She could have stayed in Germany. She could have married another powerful lord and lived in comfortable obscurity. Instead, she made a choice that would doom her to a lifetime of conflict. She returned to England. Why was this choice so dangerous? Because her father, Henry I, had been watching events unfold with the calculating mind of a medieval politician. His legitimate male heir, William A.T. Healing, had died in the White Ship disaster of 1120. The English succession was in crisis. Henry I needed an heir. And despite centuries of English tradition that said women couldn't rule, he had a weapon that no one expected: a daughter trained in the art of imperial authority. January 1127. Winchester Cathedral. One of the most significant and ultimately meaningless ceremonies in English history was about to unfold. King Henry I had summoned every major nobleman in England to witness something unprecedented. They were going to swear an oath of loyalty to his daughter Matilda as his rightful heir. But this wasn't just about succession, this was psychological warfare. And Matilda didn't even know she was the target. One by one, the most powerful men in England knelt before a 25-year-old woman and swore sacred oaths to recognize her as their future queen. Her own half-brother, Robert of Gloucester, swore the oath. Her cousin Stephen of Blois, the man who would later steal her throne, knelt and swore fealty with tears in his eyes, claiming to be moved by the solemnity of the moment. It was all theater, political kabuki designed to buy Henry I time while secretly ensuring these same men would never honor their word. How do we know they never intended to honor these oaths? Because of what happened next. Henry I, perhaps sensing the fragility of his daughter's position, made another calculated political move. In 1128, he arranged Matilda's second marriage, this time to Geoffrey of Anjou, known to history as Geoffrey the Handsome. But there was a problem. Geoffrey was only 15 years old. Matilda was 26, a mature woman who had governed an empire. The marriage was not just politically inconvenient, it was personally humiliating. Imagine a woman who had commanded the respect of Germanic nobles, who had signed treaties and governed provinces, now forced to marry a teenage boy whose only qualification was his father's strategic territory. The English nobles watched this marriage with satisfaction. They understood what Henry I was doing and, more importantly, what he wasn't doing. By forcing Matilda into a marriage with a foreign teenager, Henry was subtly undermining her authority in the eyes of English nobility. The message was clear. Despite her imperial training, despite her political experience, she was still just a woman to be married off for territorial gain. For 4 years, Matilda lived in Anjou, raising children and watching English politics from the sidelines. But in 1135, everything changed. King Henry I died suddenly while hunting in Normandy. The moment of truth had arrived. Would the English nobility honor their sacred oaths? The answer came swiftly, and it would haunt England for the next 2 decades. December 1135. While Matilda was in Anjou, mourning her father and preparing to claim her rightful throne, her cousin Stephen was making the most audacious political gamble in medieval history. Stephen of Blois had sworn a sacred oath to recognize Matilda as Henry I's heir. He had knelt before her, placed his hands between hers in the ancient gesture of fealty, and called upon God to witness his loyalty. Now, he was about to break every single word of that oath. Stephen's gamble was based on a brutal calculation. English nobles might have sworn to accept a woman as ruler, but they would never actually fight for one. He was right. Within days of Henry I's death, Stephen had seized the English treasury, claimed the crown, and was being crowned at Westminster Abbey. The same nobles who had sworn sacred oaths to Matilda stood by and watched or actively supported this act of spectacular treachery. But Stephen's coup wasn't just about seizing power, it was about rewriting reality itself. The propaganda campaign that followed would be one of the most effective character assassinations in medieval history. The official story became this: Henry I had changed his mind on his deathbed. Concerned about the dangers of female rule, he had supposedly named Stephen as his heir instead. It was complete fabrication. No reliable witness ever corroborated this deathbed change of heart. But it didn't matter. Stephen controlled the narrative now, and medieval chronicle writers wrote what their patrons wanted to hear. More insidiously, the propaganda campaign began to paint Matilda not as a wronged heir, but as an unnatural woman who dared to challenge the divine order. She was described as haughty, arrogant, and unfit for rule. Her imperial training, once an asset, was reframed as foreign contamination. Her confidence was recast as unwomanly pride. But the most devastating propaganda weapon was more subtle. They began to erase her imperial title. Matilda had every right to be called Empress. She had been crowned Empress of the Holy Roman Empire and had governed in that capacity for over a decade. But Stephen's propagandists systematically referred to her as merely the daughter of Henry I, or, most dismissively, the Countess of Anjou. This wasn't accidental. By stripping away her imperial credentials, they were psychologically diminishing her authority in the minds of everyone who heard her name. When Matilda learned of Stephen's betrayal, she didn't weep or retreat. She prepared for war. But she was walking into a trap decades in the making. The English nobility had never intended to honor their oaths. Stephen's coup wasn't just a betrayal, it was the culmination of a long-term strategy to ensure that no woman would ever truly rule England. 1139. 4 years after Stephen's coup, Empress Matilda finally invaded England to claim what was rightfully hers. What followed was one of the most complex and brutal civil wars in English history, a conflict that would later be romanticized as a chivalric struggle, but was actually a devastating example of what happens when political systems collapse. But this wasn't a war between equals. Matilda was fighting against the entire structure of medieval English society. The numbers tell the story. Stephen controlled the treasury, most of the major castles, and had the support of the church hierarchy. Matilda had her half-brother Robert of Gloucester, a handful of loyal nobles, and the moral authority of being the rightful heir. It should have been impossible, but Matilda had two advantages her enemies hadn't counted on. Her imperial training had taught her military strategy, and she understood something about medieval warfare that her contemporaries missed. Medieval wars weren't won through massive battles, they were won through a grinding process of castle sieges, political alliances, and economic warfare. Matilda understood this game better than anyone expected. Her first major victory came at the Battle of Lincoln in 1141. Against all odds, her forces captured King Stephen himself for a brief, shining moment. It looked like justice would prevail. Stephen was in chains. The throne was empty. Matilda was poised to be crowned England's first queen regnant, but this is where her story takes its most tragic turn, because winning the war wasn't enough. She also had to win the peace, and that required navigating the psychological minefield of medieval English politics. When Matilda arrived in London to claim her crown, she walked into a city that had been systematically turned against her through years of propaganda. The citizens of Ondo, and who should have welcomed their rightful ruler, instead saw a foreign woman who spoke with a Germanic accent, who carried herself with imperial authority, and who threatened to upset the comfortable order that Stephen had established. But the real trap was more subtle. The English nobility, who had originally sworn oaths to Matilda, were now in an impossible position. If they supported her, they were acknowledging that they had been complicit in for years of illegal rule. If they opposed her, they were breaking sacred oaths. So they chose a third option: sabotage. Instead of outright opposing Matilda, they supported her just enough to keep her hopes alive, while systematically undermining her authority through 1,000 small acts of disrespect. They delayed crucial decisions. They questioned her orders. They demanded concessions that no king would ever be asked to make. Most devastatingly, they began to spread whispers about her unnatural behavior. Because Matilda governed with the confidence of someone trained to rule an empire, she was labeled as arrogant and unwomanly. When she made decisive military decisions, she was too harsh. When she showed mercy, she was weak. When she insisted on her royal prerogatives, she was prideful. It was an impossible situation, a psychological double-bind designed to make her fail regardless of what she did. And then came the moment that would define the rest of her life. The disaster at Westminster Abbey, June 1141. Westminster Abbey. For the first time in English history, a woman was about to be crowned as queen regnant in her own right. The coronation robes were prepared. The crown was waiting. History was about to be made. It never happened. What occurred instead was one of the most calculated political humiliations in medieval history, a betrayal so complete that it would echo through centuries of English politics. The citizens of London, supposedly loyal subjects who should have celebrated their rightful ruler's coronation, instead rose in revolt. But this wasn't a spontaneous uprising, it was a carefully orchestrated coup designed to destroy Matilda's legitimacy forever. Here's what really happened. Stephen's supporters had spent months spreading propaganda through London's merchant classes and church hierarchy. They painted Matilda's potential coronation not as the restoration of rightful rule, but as foreign conquest. Remember, Matilda had spent most of her adult life in Germany and Anjou. She spoke with a foreign accent. Her mannerisms were imperial, not English. Her supporters included Angevin nobles who were seen as foreign invaders. The propaganda campaign was devastatingly effective. Instead of seeing their rightful queen, Londoners saw a foreign empress trying to impose Germanic imperial rule on England. But the real masterpiece of political manipulation was yet to come, as the crowds gathered outside Westminster Abbey, demanding that the coronation be cancelled. Matilda faced an impossible choice: use force to suppress the revolt and be forever labeled a tyrant, or yield to the mob and appear weak. She chose a third path, one that showed both her political intelligence and her tragic misunderstanding of English politics. Matilda attempted to negotiate. She agreed to postpone the coronation until tensions calmed. She offered concessions to the London merchants. She tried to win over her enemies through reason and compromise. It was exactly what her enemies hoped she would do, by negotiating instead of commanding. Matilda had fallen into the psychological trap that had been set for her years earlier. She had acknowledged that her authority was subject to popular approval, something no male king would ever do. Medieval kingship was based on the principle of divine right. Kings didn't negotiate with rebels, they crushed them. By showing flexibility, Matilda had inadvertently suggested that her claim to the throne was negotiable. Her enemies seized on this perceived weakness immediately. Within days, word had spread across England that the Empress had been intimidated by a London mob. Nobles who might have supported her began to recalculate their allegiances. But the final betrayal was still to come. While Matilda was trying to salvage her coronation, Stephen's queen, also named Matilda, which adds a layer of cruel irony to this story, was raising an army to rescue her imprisoned husband. Queen Matilda understood something that Empress Matilda had missed. This wasn't really about legal claims or rightful succession. This was about power, pure and simple. While Empress Matilda was negotiating and seeking compromise, Queen Matilda was gathering forces for a direct assault on London itself. September 1141. London was in flames, and Empress Matilda was running for her life. Queen Matilda's forces had done more than just rescue King Stephen. They had turned the tide of the entire war in a single, devastating campaign. But what happened next would become the most famous episode of Empress Matilda's life. And paradoxically, the event that sealed her historical erasure. The retreat from London was a disaster. Everything Matilda had fought for over 2 years of civil war was collapsing around her. Stephen was free. Her supporters were scattered, and her enemies were closing in from all sides. But instead of surrendering, instead of accepting the natural order that said women couldn't rule, Matilda did something that would echo through centuries of storytelling. She refused to give up. Visual close-up of Matilda's face during the retreat, not defeated, but defiant. This is a woman who will not be broken. What followed was a series of escapes and narrow survival stories that read like medieval adventure novels, but were actually a desperate woman's fight for political survival against impossible odds. The most famous of these escapes occurred at Oxford Castle in the winter of 1142. Stephen had cornered Matilda in Oxford Castle and laid siege. For months, she held out, hoping for rescue that never came. Food ran low. Her supporters began to despair. Stephen's forces tightened their grip. By December, the situation was hopeless. Surrender seemed inevitable. That's when Matilda made a decision that would become legend. She would escape through enemy lines in the middle of a blizzard. December 1142. The coldest night of the year. Matilda, dressed in white robes to camouflage herself against the snow, opened a postern gate and walked directly through Stephen's siege lines with only 3 companions. For 6 miles, they walked across frozen ground, following the Thames River towards safety. One wrong step, one enemy patrol, one moment of bad luck, and the rightful Queen of England would have been captured or killed. But she made it.